today we're mounting a part of the Sydney Lunar Festival looking at Chinese ceramics. And we're very lucky that we have two experts to talk to us about just these things. One is Alex Birchmore, who's a new member of staff, relatively new member of staff at the University of Sydney. And his chair and discussant will be Dr. Shusha Chen, who used to be with the China Studies Center many years ago and is now, actually I think you're the curator of the Chinese wing of the Chau Chak Wing Museum, aren't you? And that museum is also, of course, an event partner for this event. So with further ado, I'm going to hand over to Shusha. The further ado is when you ask questions towards the end of the presentation and discussion, please use the Q&A function on your on the screen so that Shusha can read questions and select questions. Thank you. Over to you, Shusha.
Thank you, David. And it's a great opportunity for the Chau Chak Wing Museum and China Studies Center to co-host this wonderful event talk by Dr. Alex Birchmore. Before I start, I also would like to acknowledge that I am zooming in from the unceded land of the Gadigal and Wongo people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It is our pleasure to be able to invite Dr. Alex Birchmore to talk about blue and white porcelain today. I would like to introduce Alex. Alex is an art historian specializing in the study of Chinese and Southeast Asian art, past, present, with a particular focus on ceramics, trade, and exchange, and the interweaving of the personal and material. Alex, actually, this talk partly based on his forthcoming book. It's probably scheduled to be launched in 2023. We might have another launch party a year time, but today we are really lucky to have Alex here to talk about the grand narratives of blue and white, which Alex will draw some blue and white porcelain from the Chau Chak Wing Museum collection, and to talk about the history, context, and also connections of the blue and white porcelain in China and beyond China across the world. So as David mentioned, you feel free to ask questions during or after Alex's talk, and make sure to put it in the Q&A, and I will help moderate the Q&A after Alex's talk. Again, without further ado, I'll pass it on to you, Alex. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shusha and David, for the wonderful introduction and the welcome to country. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm currently on Ngambri and Ngunnawal land in Canberra, unceded, as also with the lands in Sydney. I'd like to thank the China Studies Center as well for giving me the opportunity to talk, and the Chau Chak Wing Museum. I'll just get up my slides. Here we go. All right. So without further ado, which seems to be the phrase of the day, I'll start the talk. So I'm going to talk a bit about blue and white and a bit about the idea of grand narratives. And it's mostly Chinese, but also some other elements drawn in, which kind of build on the Chinese and adapt and show how it's circulated and developed and traveled over time. The pairing of blue and white is perhaps one of the most widely recognized decorative styles available to ceramicists across the world. I'm sure that many of you in attendance today have at least a few pieces on your shelves or in your cupboards. And I brought together a few from my own collection for the photo used to advertise this talk, my very amateurish photo of a few kind of mass-produced ornaments and souvenirs that I brought together, including a pair of tins, one for tea and one for biscuits, which I picked up respectively on my first trip to Beijing, as well as in my local Aldi here in Canberra. And for me, this geographic extent kind of exemplifies the extent to which blue and white itself as an aesthetic now extends far beyond the world of Chinese ceramics and far beyond China, and encompasses a very broad range of materials and cultural expressions and consumerist products as well. But the enduring association of this aesthetic with China does seem impossible to shake. So this evening gown, for example, which is one of fashion designer Guo Pei's most iconic creations, is clearly intended to signal a national identity, and it played this role to great effect when it was shown alongside comparable pieces in the exhibition China Through the Looking Glass at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2015. But perhaps we should start with the source of the vivid blue that makes this decorative style so recognizable, and I'll leave you with these fantastic images to look at while I talk a bit about the ingredients of blue and white. So the blue part of blue and white can only be produced with a cobalt-based pigment, and that's one of 4 mineral-based pigments used for centuries by Chinese ceramicists, the other ones being iron, copper, and manganese. In the hands of a skilled artist, these can create a wide range of hues, which depend on the purity of the mineral, the ratio of water to pigment, the atmosphere and temperature of the kiln when firing, and even the quality and characteristics of the clay that's used. And the clay is where the second defining characteristic of blue and white arises, the pristine whiteness of porcelain. So porcelain is a particular type of ceramic. There are 3 basic types of ceramic for people who don't know. The definition of them varies between countries, but basically you've got earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain. And earthenware, loosely, earthenware is defined by its low firing temperature. Stoneware has a higher firing temperature, and porcelain has the highest. And it also has a range of other characteristics, which again vary across cultures, but mostly people identify it with a resonance when struck, with a certain translucency, and also with a very, very pristine whiteness, which is how it gained its attraction when it was traded across the world. And this whiteness is the product of the particular things that porcelain is made of. So it's made of a mixture of a silica-rich clay known as kaolin and a mica-rich rock known as pétance, which were perfected in China over 1,000 years ago and have subsequently been admired around the world for centuries. So it's the combination of these elements that gives blue and white ceramics their distinctive charm. And in brief, just to explain the manufacturing process, cobalt pigment is painted directly onto the body of the porcelain clay, which is then covered with a transparent glaze and fired at temperatures over 1200 degrees centigrade, which are so hot that they vitrify the clay into ceramic and oxidize the cobalt. So when it's painted on, it's actually quite a dull gray. When it goes through the firing process, it transforms to this brilliant blue. And also the clay and the glaze vitrify and combine to form an almost glass-like substance. So while this combination of blue and white might seem pretty straightforward to our eyes and pretty obvious even, it actually, the story of technical, cultural, and aesthetic innovation that underlies its development is quite a tangled web, and it touches on several key episodes in Chinese and global history, which have provoked considerable debate among ceramic scholars. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those episodes now. So as indicated by the title of today's talk, the story of blue and white is a quintessential example, to my mind at least, of what have been termed grand narratives, underlying our understandings of the past. The first use of this term, grand narrative, has been attributed to the French philosopher, sociologist, and literary critic Jean-François Lyotard, who argued in his 1979 text, The Postmodern Condition, that our comprehension of the world around us is fundamentally grounded in stories which gain authority and coherence, not necessarily because they're empirically true, although they might well be empirically true, but rather through their frequent repetition and through their widespread endorsement by a lot of people. These stories not only reinforce various worldviews, but they also support the institutional structures that make up our world. They ensure the integration of individuals in social and cultural groups. And most importantly, they create a sense of continuity and predictability, embedding isolated events within larger chronological frameworks. But as you can see from the quote that I've put on this slide, and I apologize if it looks a bit wordsy, Lyotard's primary argument is that these grand narratives have actually lost their relevance for the contemporary world. And he blames this on technological advancements since the Second World War, on the rise of consumer capitalism, and on the emphasis that we now tend to place on the individual above all other things. So in the place of grand narratives, he believes that we've therefore come to rely on what he calls petit récits, or little narratives, the stories of incidental occurrences and private significance that we amass in the course of our lives. Now, I disagree slightly with Lietao, and a lot of people do. But I would argue that little narratives are not only a product of post-war sociocultural changes, but I think they can be found throughout history, interspersed with and alongside the grand narratives that structure our view of the past. As such, they can offer a corrective to reductive stereotypes and simplifications. They can complicate and interrupt the grandeur of the grand narratives with the idiosyncrasies, the accidents of fate, and the reversals of expectation that resist assimilation within those very broad, overarching stories. So shipwrecks, for example, as I discussed recently with my colleague Natalie Pearson for the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre's SEAC Stories podcast series, offer one possible source of little narratives, capturing a snapshot of the moment when they sank. And I've got a photo here from a recent pair of shipwrecks which were discovered near Pedra Branca, which is an island just off the coast of Singapore in the Malay archipelago, the Malay Peninsula, sorry, which are still in the process of being unpacked and explored. But we could also turn to the biographies, both of people and of things. And that's something I explore in my book, which Xuxiao mentioned at the start of this talk, New Export China, coming out in early 2023. And it's also something that I'd like to explore in this talk. The grand narrative of blue and white begins in the ports and kiln cities of southern China in the early 14th century, although its roots can be traced further back in time. So in this narrative, the spark that ignited what would eventually become the global fascination is attributed to Muslim merchants living in Quanzhou and Guangzhou, which were the busiest ports of the Song and Yuan dynasties. These merchants, acting as intermediaries between their clients in the Islamic courts of West Asia and ceramics wholesalers in the Chinese hinterland, most notably including those in the so-called porcelain city of Jingdezhen in Jiangxi province. So the story goes, heard that West Asian ceramicists had tried and failed to use cobalt pigment to paint the white glazed earthenware that comprised their main output. So this earthenware, and I've got a few examples, very old examples, which I'll talk more about in a sec here from the Chau Chak Wing Museum collection. So this earthenware that was produced in West Asia was one of several attempts to imitate the dazzling whiteness of Chinese porcelain. But they didn't have kaolin and they didn't have patents because those ingredients are quite specific to particularly Jiangxi in southern China, also other areas of China, but there's particularly rich, or there were particularly rich veins of those materials there. And they also lacked the technical knowledge which was required to build kilns that could actually withstand those very high temperatures. So as I mentioned, porcelain fires at about 1200 degrees, and you need a particular type of kiln to do that, as well as a lot of wood, which is what they used at that time. So in order to emulate that, these potters took the earthenware that they usually produced and they added quartz and crushed glass, which allowed them to create much more delicate vessel forms. It kind of strengthened the clay and meant that they could create thinner pots and they could create more elegant shapes. And then they took a lead-based glaze and they infused that with tin oxide, which when fired produced an opaque matte white color that could conceal the color of the clay. So the clay wasn't quite as white as porcelain clay, it was more of a grayish color. But cobalt, on the other hand, was actually something that these potters knew very well. So the earliest use of this mineral as a pigment can be traced to the 5th millennium BCE, so that's 5,000 years before the Common Era, during the pre-dynastic period in ancient Egypt, where artists used a mixture of cobalt oxide and copper to stain soapstone with a vivid blue in imitation of more valuable lapis lazuli. And then several thousand years later, Egyptian artists found a new use for cobalt oxide in the decoration of ceramics. So this tile fragment on the left, for example, illustrates perfectly the brilliant depth of color and the control of the pigment that these artists achieved. This use of cobalt to decorate ceramics later passed from Egypt to the Neo-Babylonian Empire in Mesopotamia, and that was around the 7th to 6th centuries BCE. And then it passed to the domain of the Persian Achaemenids, who ruled much of what is now Iran and Iraq from the 6th to 4th centuries BCE. These ancient techniques remained in use over 1,000 years later, when these shards from Abbasid Persia and Ayyubid Syria in the middle and on the right were created. Again, they tell us a lot about the ability of ceramicists in these areas to paint with cobalt pigment and very controlled, geometrically based designs. By the 14th century, however, according to the story of Blue and White, this skill had apparently been lost, or at least in Persia, where ceramicists experimenting with cobalt found that the color tended to blur and run when they painted it over a tin oxide glaze. So whereas in China they painted eventually under the glaze and then put it on top, with tin oxide glazed earthenware ceramics, they painted on the glaze. And then when they fired it, it kind of sunk in. So the story goes that when word of this frustration made its way to Quanzhou and Guangzhou in China, Muslim merchants in these cities thought immediately of the miraculously white porcelain on which they had built their fortunes. And so they decided to test whether the formidable talents of Chinese ceramicists could extend also to painted decoration. Naturally, when they were seeking inspiration for designs to send to their contacts in China, they turned to the Persian rugs, textiles, and metalware with which they furnished their homes, sending samples of these, as well as supplies of imported cobalt ore, to Jingdezhen, along with a specification to translate these designs using blue on white ceramics. With an eye to this apparently mediating role, ceramics historian Robert Finlay, as you can see in the quote on screen, referred to these merchants as midwives for the birth of blue and white porcelain, crediting them almost completely for the development of this ceramic icon. Now, Finlay is by no means the first scholar to endorse this explanation for the origins of blue and white, and he likely won't be the last. But there are several points of contention that this story tends to overlook. We won't have time to cover all of these today, but I would like to briefly discuss two of the most glaring. So the first is the assumption that these 14th century wares were exclusively designed by and intended for West Asian collectors and connoisseurs. And then the second is the conspicuous lack of attention paid to the influence of China's Mongol Yuan dynasty rulers. It's become something of a cliche now to refer to 14th century blue and white as a perfect blend of Chinese artisanry and Islamic aesthetics. In the Chinese Potter, A Practical History of Chinese Ceramics, which was the standard text for those who were seeking to grasp this field of study for at least 2 decades following its publication in 1976, Margaret Medley argued that the decoration on blue and white departs completely from any hitherto traditionally accepted in Chinese ceramics, and is based on 2-dimensional principles of a kind quite alien to the Chinese concept of design, in which elements move freely in space, characterized by a restraint amounting to understatement and a subdued or even somber color. Then again, in an article of 1975, so a year earlier, Medley described this as a curiously hybrid style, wholly Islamic in feeling, but with a richness and unaccustomed elaboration that would have been extremely gaudy and positively vulgar to sophisticated Chinese taste, with absolutely no place in a Chinese household. But 14th century blue and white wares are actually not wholly Islamic in design. On the contrary, they represent a synthesis of multiple cultural elements brought together by the remarkable cosmopolitanism and the diversity of Mongol rule. So as you can see from this map, the Yuan dynasty in China was one of, the Yuan dynasty isn't included on this, but you'll have to imagine it's in China, was one of 4 Mongol Khanates extending across much of the Asian continent. So you can see the so-called Golden Horde up in Russia. You can see the Chagatai Khanate, or the Khanate of the Chagatai, as it's listed here in Central Asia, and then the Ilkhanids, or the Khanate of the Ilkhans in West Asia. The government of these Khanates was a family affair, with each ruled by a son or grandson of Genghis Khan, as well as their descendants. Although large, the empire therefore remained a coherent whole, with many points of connection between the cultures and people who lived under Mongol rule. Additionally, the mechanisms of government were designed to support such connections. So ruling family members in each Khanate, for example, were granted political control or financial interests in certain areas of the other 3 to ensure mutual incentives for collaboration. Artisan populations, including ceramicists, were also frequently moved between these ruling dynasties, with the artisans themselves relocated from one region to another. And then most importantly, for the grand narrative of blue and white, merchants, and especially Muslim merchants, who tended to dominate the global trade networks of that era, received substantial financial as well as other investment from the Mongol rulers, who wished to encourage trade in their domains. So bearing all this in mind then, rather than the singular initiative of one community of merchants, the creation and promotion of 14th century blue and white was part of a long history of cross-cultural collaboration. And as you can see from these examples on the screen, there are many other ceramic expressions of this that we could note, some of which predate blue and white of the 14th century and some of which are contemporary with it. And there are others which I haven't included here, but there's a long list of other, I guess, kind of precursors or contemporary types. Although merchants facilitated the movement of such objects from producers to consumers and back again, the context for their creation arose from the cosmopolitanism of Mongol rule, and so they reflect much more than a simple fusion of Islamic and Chinese aesthetics. A couple of opposing views here. In an administration staffed with a diverse blend of people from cultures throughout the Mongol Empire, we read in Laurie E. Barnes' overview of this era, artisans were given the freedom to experiment. Barnes goes on in the text that I've cited from here to identify a range of motifs on 14th century blue and white. And all of these, pretty much all of these are present on this covered vase that I've included as an illustration. So we could talk about the cloud collar lappet, for example, which is around the top band of the vase, the petal panels, or the what are called ogival windows, scrolling plants and animals, all of which are found on both Uyghur and Mongol embroidered brocade and tapestry woven textiles, so they're very Central Asian. And then we've also got this division of space into concentric bands, which was actually derived from Tibetan tanka paintings. So again, Central Asian. Then in addition to that, we have the Han Chinese motifs, we have Islamic composition. So it's a blend of things from across the Asian continent. Then if we return to Medley, Margaret Medley, writing again in the 1970s, she argued that the Mongols were not in the least interested in what was produced. All they wanted was the revenue, she said. While ceramics historian Adrian Joseph, who I've quoted from here, following Medley's example and giving voice to scholarly consensus, alleged in 1984 that the only policy of the Yuan rulers was to exploit China and to extract as much wealth from the country as possible. This view of the Mongol Yuan dynasty as barbaric invaders took hold in China shortly after the collapse of their continent-spanning empire. So it's a case of history being written by the victors, once again, I think. Scholars writing in the early years of the subsequent Ming dynasty gave voice to a deep-seated resentment among the Han Chinese population, who had been forced to give up their unchallenged authority to these northern invaders. Anything that seemed too redolent of the previous era was denigrated, while scholars and artists dedicated their efforts instead to an explicitly Han cultural canon. But the distinction frequently drawn between the material cultures of these dynasties isn't as clear-cut as some scholars have alleged. After an initial break from Mongol precedent, multiple earlier aspects of production and decoration were revived, imitated, or further developed. So an example here, on the left, we've got a Yuan dynasty vase from the Nanjing Municipal Museum, and on the right, we have a Ming dynasty vase from the Chau Chak Wing Museum. And as you can see, they are essentially identical. So this late Ming dynasty Meiping or plum vase in the Chau Chak Wing collection provides a perfect case study for that adaptation. Although it was created about 2 centuries after the collapse of Mongol rule, it's a close replica of a vase which is now considered to be one of the most outstanding products of the Yuan imperial kilns. Framed by the characteristic cloud collar lappets, lotus petal panels, and scrolling flowers and foliage, which were copied during the Yuan dynasty from Central Asian and Mongol textiles, the central band of decoration shows a scene from the mid-14th century historical drama, Xiao He Pursues Han Xin on a Moonlit Night. In this scene, one of the heroes of the play, Xiao He, an official who served the founding emperor of the Han dynasty in the 2nd century BCE, is shown searching for Han Xin, who was a general who had grown disheartened when he wasn't chosen to lead the emperor's army, and he'd wandered off into the wilderness, which was quite a common thing for disaffected generals and scholars to do in China. So Xiao, believing Han to be essential to the military control of the empire, is shown in desperate pursuit of the general who appears on the opposite side of the vessel, preparing to cross a river. So as you can see, it's a continuum. It's not a clear break. Nevertheless, in the grand narrative of Blue and White, it is the points of difference rather than the continuities between the Yuan and the Ming that take precedence. Under the rule of the latter, we are told, the fusion of Islamic and Chinese aesthetics was superseded by what's believed to be a wholly Chinese style of painterly compositions, filled with motifs drawn from the iconography of ink landscapes, Taoist devotion, and Confucian scholarship. And this play, of course, is saturated with Confucian morals and Confucian ideals, and was written during the Yuan dynasty about the Han dynasty. So again, it's more complicated than the grand narratives make it seem. As this vase shows to us, many of the most characteristic elements of this iconographic repertoire were popular under Mongol rule, and they drew inspiration from sources beyond as well as within the borders of Ming dynasty China. Once the powerful solvent of a resurgent Chinese cultural mainstream had absorbed and fused these foreign elements within a unified style, we are told, Ming and then Qing dynasty wares came to dominate the global market for porcelain, their innate appeal proving so irresistible that they decimated local ceramics industries in nations across the world. So the grand narrative goes. And you can see a little about that in this quote from Stacey Pearson. But the problem with this conclusion, as Pearson observes, is that it positions consumption and collection as essentially passive activities, which follow a predictable and essentially identical pattern in all cultural contexts. So in most regions that encountered Blue and White, however, Pearson notes, there were many different consumer groups and consequently different patterns of consumption. And in the second half of this talk, I would like to explore two of these diverse patterns. Approaching these in chronological order, we'll turn first to the case of Delft ware. Named for the city in the Western Netherlands with which it is now most indelibly associated, this ceramic type can be defined in straightforward terms as a Dutch earthenware, coated with a tin oxide glaze, kind of like that we saw earlier on those Persian and Syrian fragments, and again painted in cobalt blue with motifs that were at first intended to emulate Chinese porcelain, but later acquired a character of their own. And once again, we have a category of material culture that recalls a very long history of exchange, but which is now associated with quite a singular national identity, as this Aldi biscuit tin, illustrates. And this tin is a perfect indication of just how deeply that identity is embedded within our collective imagination. The design on the tin also indicates the extent to which a shift from Chinese to Dutch associations came about through a gradual adaptation of motifs and designs rather than a substantial alteration of the blue and white aesthetic. It's still recognizably a blue and white aesthetic, but it's very Dutch. It has a windmill, it has a port, it has some men doing some maritime things in the foreground. But in the 17th century, when Dutch ceramicists developed what would later come to be known as Delft ware, blue and white was unequivocally affiliated with China and all things Chinese. Consumers and collectors in the Netherlands first acquired a taste for blue and white in the early years of that century, the 17th century, when the ceramic cargoes of two Portuguese galleons, the San Jago and the Santa Catarina, which had been captured at sea and brought back to Holland, were sold for outrageous prices in a series of high-profile public auctions. Before that time, Portugal had retained a monopoly over the China trade since establishing colonies in India and Southeast Asia in the mid-16th century, and that ensured that Chinese ceramics had remained costly luxuries in other parts of Europe. But that monopoly was broken following the sale of these two captured ships, and then by the founding of the Dutch East India Company, of course, in 1602, which flooded the Dutch market as well as the European market with Chinese merchandise. So at this time, most of the Chinese blue and white, which was imported into Europe, would have looked something like this bowl, on the right, which is again from the Chau Chak Wing Museum collection. It has a central design, usually featuring birds, animals, or figures in a landscape, surrounded by radiating ogival, and ogival is the shape that you see on this dish. It's sort of an oval shape, but with these little flourishes, as well as petal panels containing floral motifs, emblems of good fortune and wealth, or Buddhist symbols, and these were contained in turn within a scrolling band of flowers and foliage. And images of ceramics like this appear again and again in Dutch genre and still life paintings. I've got just one example here from Willem Kleitz-Heder. They were used as markers of wealth and status and cosmopolitan ambitions. This type of porcelain is now generally referred to as kraakware. Oh, you've got the spelling here, I think, K-R-A-A-K, kraakware. A term that's believed to derive from the Dutch adaptation of the Portuguese caraca, from which the English carrack derives, referring to a particular type of ship developed in the 14th and 15th centuries for ocean warfare and long-distance trade. Writing in 1954, Dutch ceramic historian Thies Volker linked this term to the San Jago and the Santa Catarina, establishing a derivation now accepted by most scholars. So again, we've got that quite easy narrative of, all this porcelain came from these ships, they were carracks, so it was called kraakware, and then it kind of continues from there. But it's important to note that these ships weren't actually carracks, they were galleons, and no one would have called them carracks at the time. And the term kraak was in fact used much more loosely during the 17th century to refer to a wide range of ceramics, both Chinese and Japanese, and not just this specific type of blue and white. In Europe at that time, there was very little actual, sometimes they would identify Japanese ceramics as Chinese or the other way around because there was so little knowledge about these countries. Some of the earliest examples of Delft ware were clearly influenced by the panelled decoration of late Ming dynasty pieces, adapting these for Dutch tastes. And you can see that with these two examples here, one from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam and one from the Metropolitan in New York. What I would like to speak about today, however, are the blue and white wall tiles, which became the most distinctive product of Dutch kilns, emulated as well in other parts of Europe, and of which there are 5 in the Chau Chak Wing Museum collection. Ceramic tiles have been used for centuries in Holland, as in other parts of Europe, as an attractive and hygienic floor covering, but it was only from the late 16th century that they made the transition from floor to wall. And again, I've got a couple paintings to illustrate this. So you can see the wall tiles just around the skirting in the painting on the left, and then a little further up the wall in the painting on the right, as well as I think a little in the kitchen. So this transition from the floor to the wall was motivated by, at least partially, by practical considerations. There had been a parallel shift around the same time from timber to brick-built houses, which although they were much sturdier, they tended to attract damp in port cities, situated at the intersection of large rivers and crisscrossed with canals. In this climate, wall tiles proved useful as a guard against moisture in cellars, as a protective border between plaster-covered walls and timber floors or tile floors, as in these examples, as a fireproof covering for fireplaces, as a hygienic surface for kitchens, and in many other areas of the house. But tiles also provided an ideal means to display middle-class comforts in a nation which was enjoying great prosperity generated by trade and colonial expansion. The absence in what was then called the United Provinces of an absolutist monarchy or a strong Catholic Church meant that this wealth was much more widely distributed than in other European nations, with many now able to afford luxuries like Delftware tiles. And this broad distribution of wealth is apparent in the subjects that were chosen to ornament these tiles. Rather than grand religious or mythological scenes, Delftware tiles are usually painted with images of flora and fauna copied from popular print anthologies, landscapes, townscapes, seascapes, and harbour scenes like the one we see on the Aldi biscuit tin. Images of everyday trades and occupations are another common sight, as well as idyllic vignettes of domestic life. So 3 of the tiles in the Chau Chak Wing Museum collection are painted respectively with this floral medallion, with an image of a man fishing, and with a cluster of what I think are farm buildings. One of these tiles closely resembles another tile in the Victoria and Albert Museum collection, which was manufactured in Bristol in 1750 to 75. So while Holland enjoyed a monopoly in the production of Delftware during the 17th century, by the turn of the 18th, they faced increasing competition from pottery manufactories in England, Germany, Denmark, France, and Russia, among other places, where ceramicists not only imitated the Dutch example, but also led several technological and aesthetic developments of their own. So it becomes increasingly complex, much more complex than the grand narrative lets on. The second case study for the global circulation of blue and white that I'd like to consider is one I recently discussed for the latest episode of the Chau Chak Wing Museum's Objects Matter podcast series with Dr. Craig Barker. This is also a case study with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, and some of you may have a selection of such pieces in your home. So I'm speaking, of course, about the Willow Pattern. At the risk of repeating myself, this pattern is a composite landscape design named for the willow tree, which usually takes a central place in the composition, but which can sometimes be present as a background element, or in certain cases, entirely absent. In addition to this tree, a textbook example should also include 3 other principal motifs. There should be a group of 3 figures crossing a bridge. There should be a zigzagging fence across the front, usually, and there should be a pair of songbirds. And these can each be linked to a key episode in a story of forbidden romance and divine intervention that I summarized in my conversation with Craig, so I won't summarize it again. But this story taps into a deep wellspring of escapist fantasies, which have undoubtedly ensured the enduring popularity of this design. Now, the first telling of this story was printed in 1849, but the invention of the willow pattern itself has been dated to the turn of the 19th century, variously attributed to Thomas Turner, who founded the Cawley Coalport porcelain manufactory in Shropshire in the early 1770s, and to Thomas Minton, who was an apprentice engraver under Turner's supervision, but later went on to establish his own porcelain manufactory in Stoke-on-Trent. The disagreements about which of these men first created the design as we know it today rest above all on the presence or absence of the 4 motifs that I mentioned earlier. But by 1814, the pattern had become so widely produced in so many different variations that the issue of its genesis is largely irrelevant. Furthermore, as I discussed with Craig, both Turner and Minton would have drawn inspiration from earlier Chinese landscape designs, kind of like the one which adorns this early 19th century platter. And you can see things like some birds, there's a woman kind of paddling a boat out into the river, there's a distant pagoda. It all speaks very much to the same themes as the willow pattern. And the story itself of the willow pattern would have been inspired by dishes like this. And then the creators of these porcelain dishes in China in turn drew inspiration from the long tradition of landscape painting in ink on silk or paper, which constitutes one of the most characteristic genres of artistic expression in that country, as well as from the equally venerable tradition of cultivating gardens filled with rocks which were intended to resemble mountains, ornamental streams, and flowering fruit trees. And many scholars, in fact, believe that the willow pattern may have been inspired by reports brought back to England of the gardens kept by Chinese merchants in Guangzhou, which was then known as Canton. From 1760, when the Tianlong Emperor issued a prohibition that prevented European visitors to China from venturing beyond a circumscribed area in this city, to 1842, when this prohibition was forcibly lifted by the British following the First Opium War, these gardens were the only glimpses of the China they yearned to explore that many English travelers could enjoy. Walled off from the noise and pollution of the bustling port city, they were intended to serve as sanctuaries of repose, filled with ornate rockeries and grottos, wandering pathways and streams, zigzagging bridges, miniature pagodas and pavilions, exotic birds and fish, beds of peonies, orchids, chrysanthemums, and lotus flowers, groves of bamboo, and of course willow trees. Such gardens were so alluring that the few merchants who were invited to enjoy their comforts commissioned paintings like the one on the left to carry home as souvenirs. When Chinese ceramicists came to create their own versions of the willow pattern in the mid to late 19th century, like the image on the right, which I talked about this specific piece with Craig for that podcast, they actually completed the circuit of exchange by again looking to these gardens for inspiration, looking to the English willow pattern for inspiration. So it's a very complex exchange and interchange of ideas across different countries, different cultures. But we're running a bit low on time, so I'd like to conclude with one more piece from the Chau Chak Wing Museum collection, as well as a piece from my own modest assortment of objects, and a brief reflection on the model of historical understanding that it represents. So this piece on the left was donated with many other examples of blue and white to the museum in 2011. It's a simple container of embossed tin with a convex porcelain lid, and it was likely purchased from a family-owned shop in Beijing, the Shardbox Store, which has acquired a global reputation for the distinctive souvenirs from which it takes its name. The store opened its doors in 1986 when the original owner, who was a local jeweler who had taken to collecting shards of antique porcelain that had been smashed during the iconoclastic violence of the Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s, first had the idea to turn these shards into something useful and beautiful, and of course, very desirable and marketable for the tourists that were coming into China at that time. He then passed this passion on to his son, who shared his father's interest in reviving and embellishing these fragments, and then finally to his grandson, who now owns the store and from whom I bought my own Shardbox in 2014 while I was in Beijing. In his introduction to the fragment, An Incomplete History, which is an anthology of reflections on this topic, published in 2009, art historian William Tronzo defines the fragment not simply as the static part of some once whole thing, but as itself something in motion. As such, he observes, fragments introduce a certain volatility and unpredictability into our visions of the past, serving to remind us that it is actually the fragment and the fragmentary that are the enduring and normative conditions of that history, while the whole is ephemeral and the state of wholeness is transitory. In other words, the grand narratives through which we have come to understand the past may appear seamless and undeniable, but it is in fact the little narratives that such myths obscure, which I think reveal the true complexity of our lives and of the things with which we surround ourselves. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex, for such a wonderful talk. It's informative, comprehensive, yet really insightful to start with a grand narrative, and then we wrap up with this, a little Shardbox that you got from Beijing, and to point into a new direction to little or micro narrative and how fragment, the significance of fragment comparing to wholeness. It is our Q&A section, so for the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A and I will moderate it. Probably when you are sort of thinking and constructing your question, I do have a burning question for Alex, given I have the privilege to chair this panel. I love the conclusion, as I say, how you sort of at the end suddenly point us to another brand new direction of micro narrative. And I do, like you and many people, that's why we like the wholeness or a whole piece of beautiful blue and white porcelain. I'm also really interested in the brokenness, the pieces or the fragment of it. I know that there is a technique of porcelain repairing techniques sort of in China, dating all the way back to Ming, if not before that on the Song. And such technique is using the metal stable to repair the broken porcelain and make it into a whole, which I think Matteo Ricci, the Italian priest, in his book on his mission in China during the Ming Dynasty, he mentioned such a technique. And such a technique is not sort of unpopular. It is really popular, not just to a common people, because they would like to reuse this porcelain, but also quite popular for the elite class as an aesthetic. And such repairing technique is also being used probably in later sort of developed in a different way, which contemporary people might be more familiar with the Japanese, and also you find in Korea as well the Kinjukowo technique to using the gold leaf to to fill the gap of the broken pieces. I just wondering if you could elaborate or a bit for the history of that, or the connections between different cultures sharing such a technique, but also as a aesthetic as well.
Yeah, of course. I'll just bring up the slide. I noticed someone posted in the chat that they noticed this dish has staples. They're quite hard to see perhaps on this picture, but if you can just see these little blackish silver bits here, but it shows you, and this is from the Ming dynasty, from the Wanli reign and in the late 16th century. It shows you both how established this technique was by that time, because this is really excellent work. It's barely noticeable, but at the same time, it's interesting to note that it is visible. They haven't gone out of their way to kind of make it invisible. It's part of the, in a way, part of the history of the bowl. It's part of the kind of life or biography of the bowl over time. And what it tells us is about how these objects were valued, how they were kind of treated. If it was broken, it wasn't simply thrown away and replaced with another one. It was carefully mended in a very labor-intensive process. So it involves, at this time, it would have involved drilling holes by hand with what's called a bow drill, which was essentially, if you imagine a bow, like a bow and arrow, with a drill or a pointed thing, and then you just kind of do that until you make a hole in the porcelain. But you have to be very precise. You have to have kind of a jeweler's precision, because it needs to be right on the edge of the break. And if you put it in the wrong position, of course, it will just cause further damage. It will crumble. It will cause all sorts of further damage. And then once you've drilled this hole, you then take a piece of metal. It could be silver, it could be something else, and you carefully kind of embed it in there. And there were various different solvents that we used to fix it in place. And then you would carefully draw the fragments together, and then you might reglaze it or put a bit of extra glaze over the top, and then fire it in a muffle kiln, which is a low temperature kiln, so that the metal wouldn't melt, but it would sufficiently vitrify the glaze. But it's a fantastic, hang on, I'll just stop my share. It's a beautiful, fantastic technique. And you mentioned the Japanese technique, which was inspired by it, which of course builds on that even further and highlights it even further by using lacquer and gold to really highlight the cracks. And there's some very beautiful pieces. Tea bowls, of course, are the ones that everyone thinks of with that aesthetic of wabi-sabi, or kind of old and used and worn over time. It also speaks, I think, to the contrast, sorry, I'm going on a bit, but it speaks to the contrast between our contemporary, the way in which we look at things like conservation of these ceramics, and the way in which there's been a kind of change recently, but over the past few decades, a lot of the time they would remove these old breaks, these old repairs, and fix it with epoxy resin, which is a more contemporary method of doing it, which is of course invisible and non-invasive. But I think there's a kind of poetry in them in a way, even though they might discolor the porcelain or they might look a bit ugly. They tell a story, I think.
Great, thank you. I think yeah, I think the memory, the history of that piece, that it can be sort of mended together. And I love you mentioned the emotion aspect of the fragments, and how that the wholeness could be reflected through that fragment or through that brokenness. And when you talk about also that it is aesthetically, I also see a lot of illustration, particularly in 16th century, if not 17th century, sort of between Ming and Qing-dynasty, a lot of painter such as Chen Hongshou in his really famous collection, that he particularly illustrated a broken vase with flowers. And in Wang Wen's book on tea cooking, that the tea set, that I could see that the illustration of it, you could see the stable of that broken porcelain. So it's quite a flavor that sort of also welcomed by the sort of cultural elite. I will get onto the Q&A from our audience. We have a few questions coming in. The first question asks, were floor or wall tiles produced in China?
That's a great question. I don't believe so. I mean, I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it, but that is a good question to explore. Sorry, I can't be of more use.
Thank you. And another audience asks, how is the blue and white technique being preserved today? And what is your view on the future of this technique?
I mean, it's still going strong. There's still a lot of those pieces I showed in the photo for the talk One of them, the little spherical object, was produced in, well, I'm told produced in Jingdezhen, and I bought it in a market in Beijing. So a lot of it is really for collectors, tourists, souvenirs to take back, as well as for, you know, most public buildings in China have large vases or bowls in their reception areas, which are often blue and white. And it's just so intrinsically part of what we consider to be, I guess, the Chinese brand or the brand of contemporary China, that it still remains embedded within that, as well as the brand of the contemporary Netherlands. It has those kind of dual meanings. In terms of the way it's preserved, I mean, it's still, ceramics making still goes strong in places like Jingdezhen. A lot of things, a lot of texts note that Jingdezhen kind of faded away after the imperial era, but it didn't. It just kept going, it kept adapting. It's now mostly, it's not large factories like it was. It's mostly small workshops and little boutiques and studios and things like that. There's a hefty exchange with artists. In my book, subtle plug for my book, I talk a bit about how contemporary artists have used the blue and white aesthetic and how they've worked with it as something which is so representative of China. So it remains very much so. There's just something so appealing, I think, about blue and white that it doesn't go away. It sticks around. It's such a wonderful combination.
Thank you. And another question, why are Chinese blue and white so famous apart from blue and white? One of the other countries, just compared to other countries, why the Chinese one are particularly famous?
Well, I think, I mean, it comes down really to the material, the porcelain, because no one knew how to make it outside China at that time. It was this magical material that no one quite understood how to make. And there are all these crazy theories about it being made of crushed shellfish, or that it was buried underground for hundreds of years and then dug up by the distant descendants of the person who buried it, and it would be perfectly formed as these miraculous vases. So particularly in Europe and also in West Asia, they also had some quite crazy theories and beliefs about porcelain. So the material itself proved very fascinating. But then the combination of blue and white, I think it does come down to that basic attraction of that combination, the really brilliant blue and the very kind of pure, unblemished white. It's the mixing of those two things. And then in Europe, it blended perfectly with things like the Rococo style and chinoiserie. It just blended so well with the colors and patterns and things that they wanted to achieve. In West Asia, it tapped into that long history of cobalt use on ceramics as well as on glass, and the symbolism or the associations of the color blue within those cultures with various things. It's all about, yeah, the associations of the color, the value of the material, that kind of thing.
Our next question is, does anyone produce bespoke blue and white replicas in China now? Very insightful and informative presentation.
Well, thank you for your comment. Yes, they do. There is a thriving reproduction industry in China, and you know, in Australia and in Europe and America and places, we perhaps think of reproductions and copies and replicas as something that is perhaps lesser, or that is perhaps, you know, not as desirable as the real thing. But in China, it's probably a bit hackneyed to say, but the view of reproduction is completely different. It draws on completely different cultural bases. Even in the Ming dynasty, they were imitating Song dynasty wares. In the Qing dynasty, they imitated Ming dynasty wares. As we saw, that Ming dynasty vase that I showed was a direct reproduction of a Yuan dynasty vase. And that definitely continues today. Both people who, there are obviously some people who do it as a way of perhaps drawing the wool over people's eyes and counterfeiting sometimes, and perhaps surreptitiously inserting things into auctions or museums where they might not belong. But I think they're generally the exception to the rule, and on the whole, it's very candid and people know what they're getting. But yeah, because a lot of these designs, motifs and styles have remained so popular over time that there's a lucrative market for reproductions.
Thank you. And next one is another technical one. When returning from China, what restrictions exist when one brings back old pieces? Depending on the age, historical value of the pieces, any paperwork, would you have a good reference for this? Thank you for a very informative presentation.
That is a very technical question. I can't think off the top of my head. There are import-export laws. If you look up movable cultural heritage and China, you'll find them available. The most recent ones are all in English as well as Chinese if you don't read Chinese, and they lay out pretty clearly. But there are laws about, they kind of relate to where you found it, how you got it, the provenance of it, certificates of authenticity, that kind of thing. And then Australia, of course, has its own laws. So when you bring it into the country, you'll have to declare it, and they will. I've received a few requests actually from the movable cultural heritage people who asking me to verify the authenticity of certain objects or things like that. So it will go to an expert here, and they will check into the provenance that you bring and make sure it's all above board. But yeah, there's a lot of paperwork.
That's a really practical question. Yeah, I was thinking about decoration when you are going through the custom as well. Thank you. And next one is thank you for the wonderful lecture. Here I have a question. Could you share more perspectives for studying or understanding blue and white in the theory of global history nowadays?
Yes, definitely. I mean, it's a large part of the study of what's called global history, or the theory of global history. So you'll come across those terms, global history and also world history or world art history, which are quite different. So world art history now is a bit out of fashion, and it's sort of a very holistic view of it, whereas global history is more about, as I was talking about, the interconnections and the exchanges and the kind of confusions between different cultures. So blue and white, because it is so widely spread, and because of things that I was talking about, like the Willow Pattern and Delft ware, has played a large role in the development of those theories. Scholars like Stacey Pearson, who I quoted, Anne Gerritsen is another one who's written widely about this. She has a book, actually, The City of Blue and White, which is really great if you're interested to read more. And it's gone through a few phases. So there's been historians of consumption and commodities who've looked at it as a commodity. There have been art historians like myself who look at it as an art object or an object of aesthetic appreciation. Even economic historians have looked into the marketing of it and the economics of it. It kind of hits all the bases, really. It touches all things. But there is a large and very rich literature out there, if that's something that you're interested in.
Very good tips for anyone would like to further study on blue and white or porcelain within the global history. Thank you, Alex, for the tips. And we come to the bottom, the final question. The cobalt blue shades vary from pieces to pieces, as shown in the presentation. Can you please tell us more about this?
Yes. So as I mentioned right at the start, it kind of comes down to the purity of the ore. So it was sourced from a couple of different places. The really deep blues generally come from Kashan in Iran, which is kind of the original source. And that's where a lot of the Chinese blue and white, that's where that ore came from. There are some sources in China as well, but they tend to not be quite as pure. So it comes down first to the purity of the mineral, and then it comes down to how much of it they used, because it was so expensive. If it was a piece that wasn't intended for, you know, the emperor or the court or someone important, they would tend to dilute it. So it was quite, it wasn't quite as vivid. It wasn't quite as strong a color as it could have been. It also depends on the skill of the person painting with it. So for example, sometimes you might see it might look a bit kind of bumpy, or it might look a bit rough. And that was to do with the skill of the person mixing up the pigment and also applying it to the porcelain. And then of course, when you get to the English wares and the Dutch wares, it'll often look quite faded. And that again is due to the ratios that they were using, as well as to the type of clay on which they were painting. So in China, they were painting on porcelain clay, and it really suited it. Whereas if you're painting it on an earthenware, it can tend to seep into the clay a bit, and that dilutes it again, and it can run in the glaze, which again can cause issues. There's a whole lot of factors which kind of phase into it, as well as taste, simply taste. Sometimes either the person buying or the person making might not want a very strong blue. They might want a more subtle shade. So there's a lot of variety you can achieve.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, cobalt was very expensive at the beginning when they were used in China. I think it it's probably as expensive as gold. I remember reading something about that. So, you know, really depends on who these pieces are. And great. I think we are really on time, 1:02, and have go through all the questions. If you have one more question, I could take, and I think probably Alice would be happy to take one more. But if not, that thank you, Alex, for a wonderful, insightful, and informative talk. And thank you, China Study Center, to co-hold this talk, and also Ping for putting the event together. All right, everyone have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.